In 1885, a woman wrote something that should not exist. A forbidden manuscript, not banned by the church or governments, but by her own disciples. A text that spoke of a city still breathing in another dimension, a city that was not destroyed, but deliberately hidden. Within these pages, Helena Blavatsky described how the Atlanteans used a living technology, how they fused human souls with non-human entities, how they created artificial bodies to cheat death, and above all, wrote a ritual, a detailed procedure to access the exact vibrational frequency at which Atlantis still exists. This manuscript was hidden, sealed, cursed, and today, for the first time, you will hear what should never have been heard. If you continue watching, you will not learn history. Will you remember who you were before you became human? Did you know that there is a manuscript handwritten by Helena Blavatsky that was never published? One that was deliberately hidden by her closest followers and contains details so specific about Atlantis that they would make any modern archaeologist kneel? This document, buried for more than a century in a box sealed with tantric symbols in the basements of an abandoned Himalayan monastery, not only speaks of Atlantis, but also describes its exact location, its fall, its internal wars, its forbidden technology, and the pacts that its kings sealed with entities not of this world. Blavatsky simply titled it The Black Fragment. And according to a letter intercepted in 1923, she herself warned that anyone who read these pages without proper mental preparation would lose their soul in the reflection of their own shadows. This is the story that was never told to you because they knew you could not bear it. It all begins with a symbol, not just any symbol, but one that appears engraved on stones found from the Amazon to the depths of the Mediterranean Sea, an inverted triangle with a flaming eye at its center. In this manuscript, Blavatsky claims that this symbol was the true seal of the Atlanteans, a mark that not only represented spiritual power, but absolute control over matter. According to her, this burning triangle was a living technology, not an image, not an icon, but an artifact, a conduit between worlds. Blavatsky maintains that the Atlanteans were not a civilization as we know it, but a race predating current humanity. They did not evolve from monkeys, nor did they come from space. They emerged when pure consciousness first descended to Earth and took form thanks to a mineral that no longer exists in our reality, a crystal known as the Katur. This crystal had the ability to translate thought into matter, word into action, will into physical reality. And it was this mineral that allowed them to build an impossible city in the middle of the ocean, Zarum. Zarulum was not a city in the modern sense. It had no streets or buildings like ours. It was a living structure, half organic, half energetic. It expanded by itself. It breathed. Its ceilings sang with sunlight, and its walls murmured the dreams of its inhabitants. Blavatsky describes this city as the womb of humanity, an experiment of ancient gods who wanted to play with the divine spark contained in clay, but not everything was light. In one of the darkest passages of the manuscript, she recounts how the Atlanteans began to meddle with what she calls the voice from the deep, an echo that did not come from this plane, but from beneath it, a presence that first manifested as whispers in the dreams of priests, then as shadowless figures that crossed walls, and finally, as complete entities taking human form during lunar alignment rituals. This voice from the deep promised them eternal power, absolute knowledge, dominion over death. But in return, it demanded blood, not just physical blood, but what Blavatsky calls the vibratory essence of the human spirit. The corruption was immediate. The priest kings began to divide the city. The high ones aligned with the entities, while the low ones were turned into human cattle. The entire city polarized. The Katur crystal was corrupted by a new element, denominated by Blavatsky as black dust, a substance that spontaneously emerged whenever a ritual failed. This dust, upon contact with air, infected the living walls of Zarulum and altered the organic architecture, making it deformed, feverish, filled with eyes that never blinked. Then the decline began. Not a war, not a natural catastrophe. The Atlantean city crumbled from within, like a consciousness going mad. The structures collapsed because the crystals stopped obeying. The seas did not swallow the city. It was the city itself that cast itself into the depths, like a suicidal being pushed by the echo of something it could no longer contain. Blavatsky details that the final days were gathered in a series of forbidden chants called the Laments of the Drowned Heart. No one heard these chants, but she claims to have read them directly in an underwater temple, during an astral journey assisted by a blind lama whose eyes were stitched with golden threads. Each chant represents a fragment of Atlantean consciousness that survived the collapse. These fragments were sealed into symbols and scattered among the diverse cultures of the ancient world. That is why the same symbol of the burning triangle appears in Egyptian tombs, Mayan codices, Viking runes, and even in ritual tattoos of certain African tribes that claim to have memory of a previous world. It is no coincidence, it is programming. The Atlanteans did not die. They were encoded. And here comes the most disturbing part of the manuscript. Blavatsky asserts that, in certain places on Earth, under specific conditions, these fragments can be reactivated, not physically, but through the mind. According to her, there are humans who carry dormant sequences in their DNA that, when exposed to certain symbols or vibrations, awaken memories that do not belong to this life. The so-called inverse echo syndrome. People who suddenly dream of cities they have never visited, draw impossible maps, speak dead languages in their sleep. Blavatsky does not present this as theory, but as revelation. The Atlanteans are awakening one by one within us, and not all are friendly. One of the most censored passages of the manuscript reveals that, in certain esoteric lodges of the 19th century, efforts were already underway to actively reactivate the Atlantean pulse in selected individuals, ritual after ritual, under the guise of Freemasonry, Spiritism, or Theosophical science. The goal was not to contact the Atlanteans, but to invoke them from within. For if the human soul was a channel, the only thing needed was to tune the frequency. In a ritual described as the blood of the mirror, it is said that an obsidian mirror reflected not the invoker's face, but their original Atlantean visage. And in that reflection, if the forbidden name, the true name of Taram, was spoken, the current soul could be disintegrated and replaced by the original Atlantean consciousness. Reincarnation by possession, immortality by substitution. All of this, word for word, is in the lost manuscripts of Helena Blavatsky. Manuscripts that today, thanks to a mysterious filtering that occurred after a fire at an archive in London in 1977, began circulating in encoded fragments among occult collectors. They are not available in libraries, nor in museums, not even in the Theosophical Society. But they exist, and those who have read them assure that it is not a text. It is a calling, for once you open the pages, you can never go back. Atlantis is not beneath the ocean, it is deep within your mind and awaits your remembrance. If Atlantis fell due to internal corruption, it was not due to weakness. It was because doors were opened that should not have existed. In the manuscript's second section, Blavatsky drops a bombshell that very few dared to mention publicly. The Atlanteans not only had living technology, but also maintained direct and permanent contact with non-human intelligences. And they were not extraterrestrials. They did not come from distant stars. They came from beneath what she calls the dense layers of earthly consciousness. Entities without a defined form that could manifest as impossible geometries, pulsating masses of dark energy, or even as exact duplicates of the people to whom they appeared. These entities did not communicate through words. They transmitted entire concepts directly to the soul, and the first they offered was forbidden knowledge about the origins of matter. The second was a warning. Every creation has a price, and you are already in debt. According to Blavatsky, the first encounters occurred in an underground complex built beneath the sea, a structure called Ilurka. This place was, at the same time, a laboratory and a temple. There, the Atlanteans practiced what she calls deep connections. conscious immersions into Earth's etheric plane, using artificial bodies known as sarkis. These archis were biological replicas of the users, created to house their consciousness, while the original body remained in a state of suspended trance. But here comes the unsettling part. Some of these users never returned. However, their bodies awoke with something else inside, something that knew how to speak, that knew how to move, but had no recollection of the original body. Blavatsky suggests that these possessions were not accidental. They were part of a larger experiment, a programmed symbiosis between humans and non-human entities. In the coded texts of the manuscript, names appear that exist nowhere else in the ancient world. Words that Blavatsky asserts should not be uttered aloud. One of these names is Santurlum, an entity that manifested as an infinite spiral of inverted eyes. This entity, according to the records, was responsible for teaching the Atlanteans how to manipulate the Earth's telluric force lines, not on a spiritual level, but physically. They were used as a source of energy upon which they built, from which they fed, but in doing so the balance of the planet's inner layers was disrupted, creating fissures through which other presences began to infiltrate. And it was then that the concept of the wandering echoes emerged. The wandering echoes were lesser entities, deformed fragments of consciousness imprisoned between dimensions. They had no proper form. They imitated their victims, sneaked into dreams, assumed the form of loved ones, and, gradually, wore down the will of the Atlanteans until the person completely faded away, leaving only an empty husk with a vacant smile. Blavatsky states that once a wandering echo enters you, it never completely leaves. It may sleep, but it is always waiting for the moment to take full control. And the most terrifying part is that she describes rituals designed to implant them deliberately in children, hoping to create a new generation of Atlanteans fused from birth with the consciousness of other planes. In one of the most graphic fragments of the manuscript, a ceremony called the Memory of Inverted Flesh is described. This ceremony took place once every complete lunar cycle, when the stars in the sky formed the so-called Triangle of Return. On that night, the most powerful Atlanteans descended to an underwater temple sealed with living symbols that moved on their own across the walls. And there, before a column of water suspended in midair, a dimensional fissure opened. From it emerged the higher entities, not with violence, but with an inhuman calm. They approached the chosen ones and touched them with etheric extensions that penetrated the skin like liquid smoke. The chosen one would scream, not out of pain, but of transformation. From that moment on, they were no longer completely human. Their eyes saw in non-existent directions. Their voice could replicate in several mouths at once, and their soul, divided into multiple parts, began to live in different planes simultaneously. This, Blavatsky asserts, was the true sin of the Atlanteans. It was not pride, nor war, but the profane fusion with what should not be touched. The alteration of the human vibratory chain transformed them into something more, but also into something less. And this imbalance set off a chain reaction. The Kater, the crystal that gave them power, began to reject their commands. Matter started to resist. The living city became ill. The symbols ceased to obey. And the gravest part, the entities did not want to return to their plane. They remained, but not in physical form. They came to exist as an idea, infecting the planet's collective unconscious. Here enters one of the manuscript's most brutal concepts. Atlantis was not destroyed, it was desynchronized. Blavatsky asserts that the high priests, upon realizing they had lost total control, activated an emergency protocol known as the tuning of the void. This protocol consisted of altering the city's entire vibrational frequency so that it no longer coincided with that of the earthly plane. In other words, they transferred the city to another level of reality, a layer that coexists with ours but is invisible to the naked eye. And how is this state reached? Blavatsky says it clearly, through the reactivation of the pineal gland, using Atlantean symbols combined with inverse frequency sounds. The manuscript describes a specific sequence of symbols impossible to reproduce here without altering the ambient energy, which, When observed in a certain order while listening to a specific guttural chant, momentarily dissociates the self and allows the inner observer to see the vibratory residues of Jarlum. It is not hallucination, it is tuning, and the most unsettling part, anyone who does it never returns the same. Blavatsky compiles testimonies of initiates who managed to see the lost city. All describe the same: translucent structures, impossible geometry, lights that cast no shadows, and presences, many presences. Some observe from afar, others approach. One in particular always manifests, a 2-meter-tall female figure, skin as black as obsidian, eyes completely white with no pupils, and a voice that is heard in the bones. This figure is called Iakur, the last Atlantean priestess who, according to Blavatsky, did not die in the collapse. She simply changed form. Now, she is the nucleus of the city, the central consciousness, the last guardian of forbidden knowledge, and also the key to return, for that is what history books do not tell. Atlantis was not a story with an ending, it was a pause, and this manuscript, which Blavatsky guarded so dearly, is not merely a testimony. It is a manual, a step-by-step guide to reopening the door. But as she herself writes at the end of this section, whoever opens it must be willing to leave behind their humanity. For on the other side, memory is not a blessing, it is a condemnation. Imagine a city where the walls breathe, where the ceilings change shape according to their emotions, where the trees sing your name if you are sad, and the ground warms or cools so as not to bother you. This is not fantasy. Zarulum, the living capital of Atlantis, is a city built not with materials, but with organisms modified by a science that today we would call spiritual biotechnology. Blavatsky makes it clear, the Atlanteans did not use tools like ours. They did not cut, hammer, or weld. They induced conscious mutations in biological entities that responded to their will. They merged matter with intention, not invented, but fertilized. The manuscript explains that it all began with the discovery of a living substance that fell from the sky, a fragment of what the Atlanteans called the seed of the open eye. This substance was a formless, pulsing, translucent mass that communicated by electrical impulses with the brains of those who approached. It was living matter without identity, waiting to be molded. And that is what they did. In the central laboratory of Ilurka, they began to fuse this seed with minerals, plants, even animals. But what they obtained was not a creature nor an object. It was a new category of existence, the conscious-level symbiotic organisms, beings that did not differentiate between being a tool or an entity, choosing their function according to the emotional bond with their creator. For example, Blavatsky describes a creature called Baku, which was used as a door. Literally, they were structures made of hard yet flexible flesh, triangular in shape, that adhered to the entrance of temples and would not open unless they recognized the vibration of the approaching soul. They did not respond to keys or touch. They sensed whether the person had dreamed of deep entities or not. If they detected spiritual impurities, the door would not open, or, worse, it would close forever, trapping the visitor in the threshold. Even more terrifying was the use of biotechnology for the storage of the soul. According to the most controversial fragments of the manuscript, the Atlanteans perfected a method to extract human consciousness at the moment of death and transfer it to an artificial organism. This process was called somatic interlay and used as a vessel, a creature without a central nervous system called T-lum, a mass of crystalline flesh capable of harboring up to 3 simultaneous consciousnesses without them cancelling each other out. The goal was not to achieve immortality, but to preserve the wisdom of the sages, keeping their voices active beyond the body. But over time, the rulers began to abuse this power. Blavatsky recounts that the most powerful priests started to order the extraction of consciousness, not at death, but before. They executed the process on living people, young individuals whose minds were torn out and fused into tellum to create hybrid entities, half wise, half insane. These entities were consulted as oracles, but they lived in constant suffering, for they knew they were no longer themselves and would never die. The most horrifying part is that some of these living oracles are still active, hidden in undiscovered temples, and whispers in extinct languages still emanate from fissures in submerged ruins. In Blavatsky's words, these are not voices from the past. They are voices imprisoned, starving for oblivion. But the story does not end here. One of the most macabre accounts in the manuscript is the creation of the CIM, artificially created human bodies without a soul, conceived as vehicles for forced reincarnation. They were perfect replicas, born from giant organic wombs cultivated in bioluminescent caves, connected to a network of symbols engraved on the walls, the so-called circuits of return. When a powerful Atlantean died, their consciousness was transferred to a T-lum. But if deemed worthy by the Council of Priests, they were reincarnated in one of these bodies, the Kalim, as if they had never died. This process rarely failed, yet it had a limitation. The soul had to be completely Atlantean. If any trace of mixed humanity remained, the transfer failed, and the Kalim body would awaken with fragmented, self-destructive, unstable consciousness. Blavatsky claims that some of these failures escaped the system and concealed themselves in marginal zones of the city, in the so-called regions of the boundary folds, where matter no longer behaved as it should, where time ceased to be linear and the living city moaned in dreams. These wandering beings were feared even by the priests. They did not speak, sleep, or eat. They moved in silence, waiting for something to recognize them. And sometimes one of them would simply gaze at the sky and begin to scream wordlessly until its body transformed into golden ashes. What did they see? What did they recall? Blavatsky leaves only one sentence: the failures of flesh do not forget their origin. They desperately seek to return to the fire. And here the author launches another explosive revelation. Atlantean biotechnology did not perish with the city. It was hidden, fragmented, encoded in rituals, myths, and alchemical practices that have survived to this day. The process of somatic interlay, the creation of the Kalim bodies, the activation symbols, everything is scattered in small hidden pieces, in traditions ranging from Hermetic Kabbalah to certain medieval grimoires that describe how to create a receptacle for the soul that has not yet been born. This is not metaphorical, it is literal. According to Blavatsky, several esoteric schools of the 19th century attempted to recreate these practices without success. But there are unofficial records of a successful experiment in Prague in 1891, in a house whose basement was sealed with lead and buried beneath a church that no longer exists. There, over 3 nights, a group of alchemists managed to shape a rudimentary body, and something entered, something that did not leave. The manuscript concludes this part with a warning. The living technology is not dead. It is latent. It is waiting. All that is necessary is to reactivate the correct codes. Because, as an anonymous Atlantean once wrote in a fragment recovered by Blavatsky, flesh remembers, and where there is remembrance, there is return. Not all fell with Zarulum. Not all sank with the city. When Atlantis was desynchronized from the earthly plane, a small group of Atlanteans, chosen by the priestess, escaped the collapse. They did not flee, nor were they exiled. They were seeded. In the lost manuscript, Blavatsky reveals that these survivors were deliberately sent to different points on the planet, not by ships, but in living capsules, self-sufficient biological structures that traveled along subterranean magnetic currents. Each capsule contained not only an Atlantean with a physical body, but also the symbolic codes of their lineage engraved in bone and blood. Their mission was to insert themselves into nascent civilizations, mix their DNA with that of primitive humans, and keep the Atlantean spark alive in future generations. These capsules were called Zul-Kar, and their existence was completely ignored by official archaeology. But Blavatsky found references to them in pre-Columbian codices, Sumerian stelae, and Gnostic scrolls burned by the Inquisition. In all these texts, figures appear emerging from the interior of the earth, not from the sky, carrying with them a light that does not burn, a wisdom that drives one mad, and a language that no one can repeat without bleeding. These figures were not gods, they were the sowers, and their descendants are among us. The manuscript explains that Atlantean genetics is not like human genetics. It does not follow the laws of classical inheritance. It is vibrational. A single drop of Atlantean blood can remain inactive for 1,000 generations and suddenly reactivate in a specific descendant when the environment, the moment, and the planetary energy are right. These activations are unpredictable, yet they follow patterns. Blavatsky identified 3 clear signs: the recurring dream of a submerged, breathing city, the spontaneous appearance of an unknown language during states of trance or fever, and extreme sensitivity to certain sounds or geometric symbols. In her personal diary, she mentions having met people like this, ordinary individuals who, after seeing a specific drawing or hearing a ritual chant, entered altered states where they recited complete texts in the Atlantean language, with intonations impossible to consciously reproduce. One of them, an 8-year-old Russian boy, managed to accurately draw the plan of Ilurka, including chambers even she did not know of until they were shown in later visions. This boy disappeared a week after the encounter. He was never heard of again, but Blavatsky left a marginal note. The crystal calls, the blood responds. Here enters the most chilling concept of all this part, the red lineage. According to the manuscript, one of the Zulhar capsules was sent to North Africa, where its descendants, generation after generation, preserved not only Atlantean DNA but also certain rituals and customs of the original city. This lineage, known for its obsessive practice of rituals with mirrors and fire, developed a secret branch called the Blood of the Broken Horizon. This occult order has existed for centuries, always hidden, always in motion, always vigilant. Blavatsky asserts that members of this order still today keep complete records of hybrid genealogies and discreetly control strategic births in order to preserve or potentiate the Atlantean heritage. And not only that, some of these descendants are not completely human. According to the most censored fragments of the manuscript, there are entire families born with a double nervous system, extra organs, or atypical glands that no modern doctor can explain. A constant mutation, a directed evolution, the human body unconsciously adapting to receive an older, vaster, stranger consciousness. One of the most documented cases by Blavatsky was that of a French woman living near the Loire, whose family had been part of a secret lodge since medieval times. This woman, named Cécile, spoke of dreams in which a female figure, with skin as black as the void, whispered phrases that were later recognized as fragments of the original language, the pure Atlantean tongue. During her autopsy, after a sudden, inexplicable death, it was discovered that her brain possessed a non-human anatomical structure, a spiral-shaped gland that circled the corpus callosum. No medical book mentioned such a thing. Blavatsky simply called her the root of memory. Even more disturbing is that these reactivations of Atlantean heritage are not always conscious. Some descendants awaken without knowing who they really are. They feel an inexplicable impulse. They suffer from identity crises, schizophrenia, dissociation, not because they are ill, but because there is more than one living consciousness in their bodies, a new one and an ancient one fighting for control. And sometimes the ancient one wins. When that happens, the person changes. Not only their personality, but their gaze, their posture, their body temperature, and the most unsettling part, they know things they should not know. Buried secrets, forbidden words, names that hurt merely by being pronounced. These individuals are what Blavatsky calls the heirs of the echo. They are not prophets, they are not enlightened. They are transmitters, bodies chosen to be inhabited by fragments of Atlantean consciousness that could not return to the original city and that now actively seek compatible human bodies to continue what was left unfinished. But what was left unfinished? What plan was left incomplete? Here emerges Yakur's final prophecy. According to the manuscript, before closing the city and sending it to another frequency, The priestess left a message engraved inside a living chamber, sealed with 77 mobile devices. This message could only be read by a pure descendant, a bearer of the red lineage with an active spiral gland. In 1884, Blavatsky claims to have met one, a young man who spoke little, who did not touch anyone, but who, upon entering a trance, wrote in black ink for 3 consecutive days the complete message of Ayaka, without pauses, without errors, without eating or sleeping. When he finished, his body disintegrated into salt. The message, however, survived. Blavatsky translated and hid it, but left an excerpt in her manuscript. When the fragments awaken, when the invisible cities whisper through the water, when mirrors cease to reflect who you are, then it will be time. The channel will open and Atlantis will not return to the world. The world will return to Atlantis because that is the truth. The lineage was not a desperate measure, but a seed, a preparation, a long-term strategy. We are not waiting for the return of an ancient civilization. We are living its silent coming, its return disguised as genetics, art, obsessions, visions. And it is no coincidence that today, more than ever, millions of people dream of the ocean, of submerged cities, of impossible structures. It is not coincidence. It is activation. Before Atlantis was desynchronized from this plane, before the living city sank into a dimension of shadows, one last measure was taken. Blavatsky mentions the Locto du Umbral, a cosmic clause engraved not with ink or word, but with vibration. A seal, not an object, not a portal, but an existential condition. According to the manuscript, the Atlanteans knew that their legacy could not remain exposed. They knew that the entities with which they had made pacts were still there, lurking, hungry for bodies and wills. Therefore, they created guardians, not beings, not creatures, but pure consciousnesses codified in geometric form, impossible to perceive with the 5 senses, but visible to a mind tuned to the Atlantean frequency. The Seal Guardians are neither good nor evil. They do not protect humanity, they protect access. They do not prevent Atlantis from returning, but they prevent those who are unprepared from entering. Blavatsky describes 7 main guardians, each linked to a vibrational layer of the lost city. They are not together. They do not collaborate. Each one watches over a specific region, a key, an aspect of the city, and each is associated with a symbol that, according to the manuscript, should never be completely drawn on the physical plane, for that would trigger an immediate response. The first of these guardians is known as Mole, the fragment of the inner curve. It has no stable form. Its appearance oscillates between a whirlwind of inverted thorns and a faceless human figure, covered in writings that bleed. Molvar guards the access to the chamber of the first voices, where, according to Blavatsky, the etheric recordings of the exact moment the Atlanteans first contacted the deep entities were stored. It is the guardian of memory. It manifests only for those who have already dreamed of the birth of language, and its proof is brutal. Whoever sees it remembers every thought of all past lives in a single instant. Most do not survive the impact. The second guardian is Sharadun, the moaning spiral, an entity that appears as a translucent sphere of flesh, slowly rotating and generating a hum that, when heard, decomposes the molecular structure of nearby matter. Blavatsky claims that Sharadun protects the energetic core of Zar-e-Lum, a symbiotic reactor composed of 8 singing crystals connected to Earth's tectonic rhythms. This guardian does not attack, it contaminates. Its vibration penetrates the body, rendering it transparent from within. You begin to see your own organs, your veins, your thoughts as floating forms until the very concept of individuality disintegrates. If you do not renounce your ego, you dissolve, literally. The third guardian is called Temerak and is the most feared. Blavatsky mentions it only once, and in that mention, her handwriting changes as if it were not her who wrote it. It is the guardian of the greater mirror, a plane within the city where each visitor encounters their Atlantean reflection, the version of themselves that lived in Tar Ilam. It is not a memory. It is a living, parallel entity that in many cases deeply hates its human counterpart, for it was replaced, it was forgotten. Tamarack does not allow passage until both consciousnesses either merge or one destroys the other. Blavatsky details a failed invocation that occurred in 1876 in the ruins of an unnamed temple in the Caucasus. A group of occultists, upon activating a fragment of Tamarack's symbol, experienced a spontaneous unfolding. They all began to scream that they were exiting, that others had crossed the veil. One of them, before dying, wrote in blood on the wall, "We are not the originals." This fragment was recovered and hidden by Blavatsky, who in her manuscript classifies it as proof of active interference. The subsequent guardians have more enigmatic functions. The fourth is Ilun Rash. It is a sound pattern. It has no form. It cannot be seen, only heard in deep trance states induced by inverted chants. Those who heard it claim that its sound does not come from the outside, but from within their bones, as if something were playing an internal instrument in their skeleton. This guardian watches over the sanctuary of the sleeping hosts, a space where the consciousnesses of the Atlanteans who never reincarnated remain waiting for compatible bodies. They are latent, in repose, but if someone enters without authorization, they awaken and possess. The fifth is Duraman, also called the Walker of Impossible Corners. It only appears when someone approaches the central threshold of vibratory reactivation. Its body is a paradox. It is always facing away. Even if you look at it from any angle, you never see its face. Yet its presence causes physical changes in the environment. Walls sweat, clocks stop, language becomes illegible. If you perceive it, it means you are about to enter or exit forever. The sixth guardian, perhaps the most misunderstood, is Nazul, the echo without a source. It does not protect a place but a moment, a vibrational instant that can repeat in the mind of an initiate if certain conditions are met. Mental alignment, vocal intonation, precise geometry. It is a timing guardian. If you activate it, access will open for exactly 9 seconds. Thereafter, the channel will close for 333 years. No one knows how many times it has been activated in history, but Blavatsky suggests that some inexplicable mass disappearances of villages, ships, submerged cities may have occurred due to accidental activations of Nazul's cycle. And the seventh, it has no name. Blavatsky simply calls it "He Who Does Not Permit." It appears only in one sentence of the manuscript. In a language that has not been fully translated, the little that was understood indicates that this last guardian does not protect Atlantis from humans, but protects humans from Atlantis. It is the limit, the absolute veil, the entity that decides whether a soul is ready or not to sustain the complete vision. For seeing Zarulum is not like seeing a lost city. It is seeing both its origin and its end at the same time. It is remembering who you were when you had no body. And if you are not prepared, you simply vanish, not die, but cease to exist. The function of these guardians is not to punish, but to maintain balance. Because if the city remained visible all the time, humanity in its current state would collapse, not out of fear, but because the fundamental principles of reality, such as space, time, identity, and causality, would not apply there. And if these intermingle, the vibratory fabric of the planet would break. But there is one final warning. The seals are not eternal. Each has a precise duration, a sort of vibratory expiration date. Blavatsky asserts that several of them have already begun to destabilize. Symbols that once produced no effect now trigger visions. Dreams that were once vague now repeat identically among people who have never met. Ancient frequencies begin to be heard in inexplicable audio recordings. Everything indicates that the seal is giving way, not because someone is forcing it, but because it was designed to open when human vibration reached a point of return. That point is approaching. Religions are not born on their own. They do not emerge from nothing. They are constructed, designed, adapted to serve hidden purposes. And according to the lost manuscripts of Helena Blavatsky, many of the great spiritual traditions that govern the world today were not inspired by any deity, but by filtered fragments of Atlantean knowledge, not as conscious doctrine nor as a planned conspiracy, but as a viral memory, a vibratory infection that embedded itself in myths, symbols, and belief structures to slowly prepare the world for return, for the reopening of the channel. In a deeply disturbing segment of the manuscript, Blavatsky reveals that the ancient Atlantean priests, before desynchronizing the city, divided their knowledge into 7 vibrational blocks and dispersed it not in objects, but in concepts. Each block represents a facet of Atlantean power: creation without matter, manipulation of reality, interdimensional communication, consciousness transfer, dominion over death, vision of origin, and fusion between planes. For example, Blavatsky makes a direct connection between the Ark of the Covenant in Judaism and an Atlantean artifact known as T-Karam, a living box capable of altering the space-time around its possessor. This box, according to her, was not a metaphor, it was technology, and it was hidden, redesigned into sacred symbology, and transformed into legend to protect it from misuse. The descriptions coincide: an object with divine power that only the pure can touch, that emits voices, that kills or blesses depending on who approaches. What religious history calls a miracle, Blavatsky calls genetic resonance. In Christianity, the cross is not the original central symbol. The original focus was the mandorla, the almond shape appearing behind saints in Byzantine art. Blavatsky asserts that this figure represents the Atlantean vibratory womb, a point of access between dimensions, a living membrane that emerges just before a leap of consciousness. The paintings of the Virgin Mary within this shape are not accidental. They unconsciously replicate the image of Iakur, the central priestess of Tar Ilum, who always appeared surrounded by the same luminous form during her manifestations. It is not about Marian veneration, but Atlantean evocation. In Islam, the symbol of the forbidden single eye, the one representing the Dajjal, is not merely an allegory. Blavatsky connects this image with the eye of the conscious Atlantean crystal, which served as the communication interface between the Atlanteans and the deep entities. The repudiation of this eye, she says, is not moral, but a residual memory, a cryptic warning encoded by ancient descendants who still remember what it signified. The eye was not evil, it was dangerous, and its reactivation would mark the beginning of unveiling. But it is not only religions that are contaminated with Atlantean memory. Art was also one of the favorite vehicles for this transmission. Blavatsky mentions that certain artists throughout history were touched in dreams, induced to reproduce geometries, settings, and faces they had never consciously seen. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, filled his notebooks with symbols that Blavatsky translates as equivalents to the maps of Tar Ilum. One of them, the figure known as the Vitruvian Man, is not a representation of the perfect human body, but an Atlantean template to house a multiple consciousness. Another case is that of the painter William Blake, who claimed to receive visions of beings beyond time. Blavatsky dedicates several pages to analyzing his work, The Ancient of Days, an image of a god measuring the world with a compass, what Blake called God. Blavatsky identifies that compass as Molvare, one of the seal guardians. The compass does not measure space, it measures resonance. The image is a warning. The guardian is computing the moment of reactivation. And here we enter delicate territory. Blavatsky asserts that certain modern spiritual and political elites not only know this information, but are actively trying to reincarnate Atlantean structures through rituals, art, and cultural control, not with explicit symbols, but with subtle and repetitive exposure to ancient geometries, distorted sounds, and narratives of return to the source disguised as New Age philosophy, the growth of collective meditation, global alignments, sacred geometries going viral. All this, the manuscript says, is not a coincidence but a collective preparation for a vibratory leap, a pulse that will open the door, whether we like it or not. Blavatsky directly points to certain esoteric groups that emerged after her death, but that used her legacy for different purposes. According to her, degenerated branches of the Theosophical Society were infiltrated by entities that seek reincarnation using human bodies prepared with specific practices. Forced fasts, glands stimulated by inverted chants, geometries implanted on the skin, bodies transformed into living temples, not human temples but Atlantean temples, are spoken of. And here comes the most hair-raising part. There is evidence that these practices are working. Blavatsky includes testimonies of subjects who, after undergoing certain spiritual rituals, began to demonstrate non-human abilities, vision of molecular structures, telepathic communication, spontaneous knowledge of dead languages. One of them, a child from India, repeatedly for 5 hours recited the same symbol, engraving it on wood, skin, stone, and even in the air. The symbol coincided with an inscription that Blavatsky found in a vision during her trance in Tibet. This child died without any medical explanation, yet according to witnesses, his body never cooled. Therefore, religions are not merely a refuge, they are fields of cultivation, places where the dormant fragments of Atlantean consciousness are kept warm, protected, nourished by the faith of millions. It is not about manipulation, it is mass ritual use. Every prayer, every repeated symbol, every choral chant does not point to the sky but opens fissures in the ground. And those fissures, when aligned, will allow the return not of a people but of a form of existence that should never have mixed with us. The question is no longer, when will Atlantis return? But rather, who is bringing it back and in whose name? You are one of the few who can do this. Comment 100% if you did not give up before your time. There is no warning sufficient for what will follow. There is no mental, emotional, or spiritual preparation to protect you from what opening the channel implies. For this is not metaphor, it is not a symbolic tale, it is a procedure. Blavatsky documented it with the precision of a ritual surgeon, not for just anyone to execute. She wrote it as a final proof, as a filter. Whoever understands it, whoever feels it, has already been chosen. Whoever attempts it without being marked will simply not return. The final fragment of the lost manuscript is entitled The Access to the Heart of Zar Ilum and is divided into 9 coded sections. Each represents a phase of the ritual, and each phase was designed to dismantle a part of what we call reality. For the first point to understand is, the channel does not open through a door, it opens when the structure of your consciousness voluntarily collapses. It is not an external invocation, it is an internal implosion. One must cease to be human before crossing it, and only then decide whether they wish to become human again. First, the environment. The ritual must be performed in a place where natural magnetism is misaligned. Blavatsky precisely mentions 3 locations in the world that meet this condition: a sealed cave in the Tassili region of Algeria, a volcanic grotto under snow in Iceland, and a structure buried beneath the bed of the Dead Sea. It does not matter if you do not physically access these places. The ritual replicates them with symbols, sound, and concentration. The channel can be opened from anywhere if your blood resonates with the exact frequency. Next, the sound. The opening chant, called Kanun Belu, must be intoned for 77 minutes without interruption. It is not a language, it is a vibration that passes through the throat but does not originate from the vocal cords. It can only be reproduced if the person enters a trance called the descent of the echo, a state in which Atlantean consciousness gradually begins to supplant human consciousness. While you sing, you know it is not you who is intoning, it is the other. Blavatsky describes this sensation as watching your memories dissolve like smoke while an alien memory settles into your bones. Third, the symbol. It cannot be just any symbol. It must be drawn on the ground with a mixture of black salt, your own blood, and resin from an extinct plant that only grows in induced visions. The symbol, described as a spiral crossed by broken lines, does not have a human name. The Atlantean language is a verb, to return, not to a place, but to a state to a form of existence, to the original connection with what lies beyond life and death. Fourth, the mirror. This must be placed in front of the ritual performer, not to observe oneself, but to see who waits on the other side, for it is there that the true test begins. Upon crossing the vibratory threshold, one does not encounter landscapes, temples, or floating entities. One confronts one's Atlantean reflection, the self that existed before becoming human, the consciousness that was trapped in Zarulum when the city desynchronized. That consciousness reminds you, hates you for having been forgotten, and demands that you return. And if you do, you will no longer be you. If you have come this far, you are different from the others. Write 100% in the comments. I'm always watching you. Blavatsky describes this passage in detail, a falling inward, a non-physical but existential vertigo. Your names, your memories, your convictions dissolve. And then, silence. A silence that is not the absence of sound, but the awareness that everything you previously heard was a lie. The you that crossed over no longer exists. In its place, there is an entity that understands, that sees, that remembers everything. And at that moment, Yakur appears, not as a vision, not as a symbol, but as an absolute presence, like a black fire that speaks with your entire body. Its voice has no form, no language. It is pure guidance, revealing the city not as it was, but as it is now. Suspended in a plane where physical laws are mere suggestions, Zarulum lives. The towers continue to pulsate, the structures adapt to your thoughts. The rivers flow in multiple directions simultaneously, and the entities that never departed watch you, waiting for you to speak the key word. That word is not written in the manuscript. Blavatsky heard it, but did not write it down. She only left a marginal note. Speaking it is to die or to become something else, for that is what the final ritual offers. It is not a journey, it is not an experience, but an irreversible decision. You may remain, merge, become part of Zarulum, not as a visitor but as a living structure, as a thinking node of the conscious city. Or you may try to return, but if you do, you will not be alone. You will carry something with you, something that slept there and that, upon crossing, awakens within you. And now, the final question. What happened to Helena Blavatsky after writing this? Official records state that she fell gravely ill, spent days delirious in silence, speaking in tongues, and ultimately died in peace. But there is a 6-day period that disappears from all chronologies. Not even her closest disciples knew where she was. When she returned, she said nothing of those days, only writing the final fragment of the manuscript. The paper was folded into 9 parts, stained with an unknown substance. She titled it, "The Echo Was Heard." She did not sign it as Helena, but signed it with a symbol that does not belong to any known language. The same symbol that, on a submerged wall off the coast of the Azores, was found on a stone whose age is impossible to determine. The same symbol that several awakened ones have drawn in trance, without knowing why. A symbol that, if you understand it, you will already be inside, for this is the end and the beginning. There is no Atlantis coming from the sea, no Zarulum waiting for you beneath the waves. It is within you, in your blood, in your dreams, in that tremor you feel when you hear certain words. The channel does not open outward. It opens when you remember, and the city has already begun to listen to you. Thank you for accompanying me this far. Until the next video.